Hey, good morning, guys. It is March 19th, and we're reading out of Hebrews 11 today for Chambers. And I'd recommend you read at least the first half of that chapter. It's really, really good. It's Hebrews, obviously, and Hebrews 11 is these fathers of faith, and it deals with from the beginning on the people that acted in faith and God, well, like Abraham, credited to them as righteousness. A couple things stood out to me. The first thing that stood out to me is Hebrews 11:3, and I'd forgotten that this was in there, and it is the proper response when believers, people who say they are believers, and that word I don't use it lightly, especially in this context, want to explain away the creation or evolution of the world with worldly wisdom, if that makes any sense. 11:3, Hebrews 11:3 says, By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen, all of that's around us, was not made out of what was visible." And so it's interesting. We try to intellectually, and there's plenty of evidence, but it's getting to the root of it. We understand that the universe, by faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today, but I thought it was a really interesting catch. Chambers is dealing with being separated, living a life of faith. What does that do, and how is that different from sanctification? Even he talks about the separation in the Old Testament. People like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Noah. Think about Elijah. Think about Enoch. Enoch was, he walked with God and then he was no more. The people that God kind of separated out physically, had them separate themselves from their families, their cultures. You can only imagine what Noah had to deal with when he was building the ark. But he says today the separation is more of a mental and moral separation. Being separated, as we talked about yesterday, not being yoked together with unbelievers in their thoughts and their ways, their actions. Faith never knows where it is being led, Chambers says here, but it loves and knows the one who is leading. And so that's the thing about faith. And sometimes we get really, really confused with if our worldly pursuits seem to the world to be unsuccessful. A lot of times we think as believers that we are not being blessed by God. I'll repeat that. If our worldly pursuits we don't deem as successful, we think that God is not blessing us, and vice versa. A lot of times we catch ourselves thinking that if our worldly pursuits, business, family even, if our worldly pursuits are successful, we feel like we are being favored and blessed by God. Now, while those two may be true, they are not mutually inclusive. I guess I know mutually exclusive, but it doesn't mean one does not mean that the other is true. It Faithfulness is knowing God. So the root of faith, he says, is the knowledge of a person, and one of the biggest snares is the idea that God is sure to lead us to success. So the root of faith is the knowledge of Jesus. He goes on to say down later in the chapter that the life of faith is not a life of mounting up with wings. So mounting up with wings being, look at me, I'm flying, I'm soaring, I'm succeeding, everything is going my way, but a life of walking and not fainting. A life of just the steady walking, understanding whose hand we're holding. It's not a question of sanctification. The faith has been tried and proved and has stood the test. And the last thing that caught my eye was that very last phrase that Chambers says here, which is Abraham believed God. And it's interesting because sometimes we overcomplicate even the gospel. We overcomplicate the gospel. And the gospel is the same gospel that stood true with Abraham. And with Abraham, the root of the gospel is in the fact that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so that's I think that's a really interesting point. Sometimes we confuse and conflate, and we add to, but believing God is the root of faith. Just believing God, and that's credited to us as righteousness. So obviously, that's believing God that He sent His Son, believing God that He died on the cross, believing God that He rose again, believing God that He paid the price for my sins. But at the root is believing God. And so, anyway, walk with God today, um, and maybe not focus so much, myself included, on what we think as the blessings of God, but just the joy of walking with God. Have a great day, guys.